Okay, good morning. We're going to begin chapter 29. Our goal for today, chapter 29 is a very short chapter, not very eventful, but still important. And then we're going to move to chapter 30, which is going to be a little bit more eventful. And so our goal for today is to try to finish Perakim Kaftet and Lamed, 29 and 30. A lot of Pesukim, but they run pretty smooth. It's really going to talk mostly about David. So whereas last class we talked about Shaul a lot, we're going to transition to David. So the structure of these chapters as we're coming to the close of the first book of Shemuel is that we keep alternating, we keep flip-flopping between what's going on in Shaul's world and what's going on in David's world. After David and Shaul separated from each other for the final time in chapter 26, we then, in chapter 27, talked about David, chapter 28 back to Shaul, chapters 29 and 30 back to David, chapter 31 back to Shaul. We keep flip-flopping to kind of get into each one's individual world, and that structure allows us to compare and contrast what's going on in David's world with what's going on in Shaul's world. Shaul is on his way down, David is on his way up, the sun is rising for David, the sun is setting for Shaul, and we'll see a lot of these hints and mentions within the context of the Pesukim that we're mentioning. In last week's chapter 28, we read about a pretty low point for Shaul, where God will not respond to his inquiries about what to do with the Philistines. He doesn't have the ephod to answer to. There's no Kohanim around that will give him advice. There's no prophets around. God won't answer him. And Shaul has to resort to very dark channels by going to a sorceress to be able to ask questions about what's going to happen with the Philistines. She has to bring Shemuel, back from the dead to converse with David, with Shaul. And so it's all very, very dark. It's all very unfortunate. Shaul receives the word that he's going to die in battle, him and his children, against the Philistines, which is going to be the final chapter 31 of our book. And so things are not looking great for Shaul, and his situation is pretty dark and pretty bleak, evident from the fact that everything that happened in last chapter happened all at night. Shaul is disguising himself. He has to go at night. He leaves at night. Everything's happening in the darkness. It's kind of synonymous with everything that's going on in Shaul's life. He's living in darkness. Versus what we're going to see in chapter 29 with David, everything for him happens in the light of day, in the early morning, because the sun is rising on David as it's setting on Shaul. I wanted just to touch on one brief point at the end of chapter 28 that we kind of left as a cliffhanger, which was the concept of dark magic, right? We saw that Shaul went to this sorceress to raise Shemuel back from the dead, and we noted that that's something that the Torah does not allow for, this type of dark magic and seances and sorcery and things like that. Shaul obviously violates the law by doing that. But the question is, do these things really work? Is it just a hocus pocus? Is this really happening? What's sort of going on over here? So I'll briefly lay out three different approaches to the situation. One approach is a very extreme, rationalistic approach brought down by a rabbi named Rav Shaul ben Chofni Gaon. And he wants to say that everything that happens in the dark circle of things, it's all a show. It's all deceit. There's no reality to any black magic, to any sorcery, to any witchcraft. All of it is pure deception. It's pure hocus pocus, no pun intended, right? And it's all just sleight of hand. Right? And that means that he's going to run into a problem with, so what happened over here in this story? What happened with Shemuel coming back from the dead? And basically he says it was all a ruse. That it didn't actually happen. Shemuel didn't actually come back from the dead. He never spoke to Shaul. The sorceress had a sense that it really was Shaul and played along so that she wouldn't get attacked by Shaul because he was trying to cleanse the land, purge the land of all these types of women. And so she played along, and she had a guy dress up, and she had him pretend, and she had him look like this, and say things in a low voice, and it was all a charade. That's how he looks at it. That's one approach. The rabbis find that to be very difficult when you read the text of the Navi, that Shaul could have the wool pulled over his eyes so easily by a woman who doesn't really know who Shemuel is and kind of just makes up this whole charade, seems very unlikely. But Rabbi Shemuel ben Hofni is adamant about maintaining his ideology that these things are fake, right? And basically he's saying that the reason why the Torah outlaws it is because it is fake, because it's just pulling the wool over people's eyes. It's because of its fakeness that the Torah doesn't allow it. That's one approach. A second approach is brought by Rav Saadia Gaon and Rav Hai Gaon, who also agreed that the sorceresses, that generally speaking, sorcery and witchcraft is a fake. But here it wasn't. Why wasn't it? Because God allowed it to happen. And this is why the woman was so surprised when Shemuel actually did come back from the dead. It says that she screamed, she let out a great cry. Why did she let out a great cry? Because she wasn't expecting something like that to happen. In her mind, she knows, I'm just putting on a show over here, and then all of a sudden she puts on a show, and this thing actually happens. Because God summons Shemuel back from the dead to speak to Shaul, and it actually works. That's why she's so surprised. This approach is also somewhat difficult, because if God, in the end of the day, brought Shemuel back from the dead this way, why didn't he just answer Shaul all those other times that Shaul was asking? Why didn't he just come to Shaul in a dream? Why didn't he just allow Shaul to have a prophet? Right? Why would God only respond to Shaul in this type of a dark magic way? Why not, if he was in the end of the day going to make it happen anyway, why not just do it in a more legitimate way?
Yeah.
So,
happened,
huh?
So you're saying it never happened.
So it's kind of hard to stomach the idea that really these things are fake and God was making it happen this way. Because why would God do it that way?
Because maybe Shaul didn't deserve the easy approach.
So maybe you could justify that. You could say that God was really not wanting to, but once Shaul went to such lengths and went to the bad side, God said, okay, I'll give you something, but it's not good.
But
Maybe.
that would be sort of opposite, but maybe because like the message changed, like now God is saying like, how many chances like that?
Right.
And now you're dying tomorrow and
Right.
and that's it.
So some people actually look at it that way, that Shaul's punishment was so harsh because he went to this extent, because he went so far. Right. God was trying to help him by not answering him, and then once he did this, God's like, all right, I'll answer you, and guess what? You're going to get punished for all these things that you did. Right? Yeah. A third approach is taken by the Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, and he says that he adopts the approach of many commentaries that there is a concept of dark magic that exists in the world. This can be done, that God created the positive and negative forces of nature. There is what they call koach hatum'ah, power amongst the impure. There are impure ways to pray and play on the forces of nature. And the Torah outlaws us from doing these things, despite the fact that they exist. But they do exist, and they do have validity to them, right? We're just commanded by the Torah not to engage in them because they're impure. But when Shaul went to this woman, she was able to do such things. She did have the power to bring people back from the dead. And she really did bring Shemuel back from the dead. And that these are things that we're not permitted to do, but do have power to be able to do. And that would take on a much more literal reading of the text, which fits a lot simpler, but many people had a hard time with it because they didn't want to believe or didn't want to take the approach that these dark things did exist in the world, that God would allow these things to kind of work.
Is the opinion that they existed and now no longer exist?
They still exist.
They still exist.
And there are many sources that indicate that they still exist. If you look through the Gemara, there's many stories of rabbis getting into confrontations with Gentiles who would say incantations and do charms and put together potions. And there seems to be a lot that was going on in medieval times that had the power to, and that the rabbis recognized this power and often did things to combat this power, use the power of the Torah and the power of goodness to try and deflect these negative forces of nature. So I would say that that's more of the overwhelming majority approach, and this story seems to support that in its literal reading.
So when we were in Israel, one of the things that was like funny to me was this, the things that they put on babies' cribs, which were like totally, that there was a demon called Lilith.
Right.
And they were all like afraid of this demon and they put on these amulets in order to protect the baby against
Correct.
Lilith. Like
Yes.
a specific demon that so is that
So-
That's the one we do the Zohar the night before.
Okay, so there is, I'll address that point. Actually, the rabbis are, so there is a Kabbalistic approach, a more mystical approach, that takes into account that there's what they call a male and female version of darkness, right? And we don't even really pronounce their names. You'll find sometimes in Sidurim, you'll find them written in small in parentheses. If you have certain Sidurim, they tell you at certain times when you're reading certain berachot of the Amidah or something to have in mind these male and female versions of demons and negative spirits, so to speak, that exist in the world. And the Zohar speaks a lot about them. Yes, Zohar speaks. Particularly it speaks about it in the context of sexual indiscretion, right? As having an impact and an effect on that. Now, the Rambam Maimonides was very much opposed to these types of approaches. He viewed everything as coming from God. God is the source of both good and evil. Everything comes from him. And he was a harsh critic of people who used Torah or charms or things like that to try and manipulate different forces of nature, both positive and negative. He was very much against even using Torah for example, he writes about in his laws of Avodah Zarah, a person who puts a Tehillim book under the mattress, or someone who puts a pair of tefillin in a baby's crib so that they'll sleep or be saved from night terrors. He says, not only are these people involving themselves in superstition and in dark practices that we're forbidden from, but they're also demeaning the honor of the Torah. Because the Torah is meant to fix and refine a person's spiritual side, not to help a person get out of physical trauma that they may be suffering from. So a person should pray to God for help, a person should connect with Hashem through the study of Torah, but to use a pair of tefillin as an amulet to try and heal because you believe that it has powers independent of God is a problem. The Rambam was a harsh detractor of these things, a critic of these things. He only allowed certain things like amulets and medicinal things when a person's life was in danger as a placebo effect, as like putting a person's mind at ease. That he does right, that is allowed, but he didn't give these things any real credence or validity or power independent of God. Rambam, I'd say, was in more of a minority amongst other rabbis, especially those from Sephardic tradition that descended from Spain, like the Ramban and the Rashba and others who were very mystical in nature, that they believed these things did have powers to them and that the Torah could be used as a force to go about combating them. And of course, our Middle Eastern descent in connection with the Arabs and Islam also has a major impact on that because we know that they're a very superstitious culture as well. So these things have found their way into our culture, into our way of life. I think it's best that a person try to take the Maimonidean approach to stay away from them as much as possible. I think in a more modern day view, I think it's important for us to rationalize what we could see, to make sense of things from a logical perspective, and to always connect through prayer. That's the most important thing. Prayer and the study of Torah and growth in spirituality are really the major ways that a person should always try to connect. I think we try to take shortcuts sometimes, try to take the easy way out, and that can be the wrong way in many situations. So that hits to this argument, yes.
Sort of like there.
You're right, but I think it's a critique. I think looking at David versus Shaul, and you're seeing the resources that Shaul is using and versus the ones that David is. David's taking the hard way, and Shaul is taking a different path. And the Navi is being critical of Shaul in this way and trying to steer us towards the other approach. Right? Yes.
So during Passover, we are able to. So the Jews are able to do certain things, but the Pharaoh calls upon his people to do certain things, and I say, well, how did they do that?
Excellent. An excellent question. People always bring this up. The Khartoumim, right? The sorcerers of Paro, who's copying the different plagues that are happening in the story of Pesach, right? So again, a similar approach would probably be taken. The Rambam might turn around and say that the sorcerers were very good at using sleight of hand. They found ways to use deception to pretend as if they were recreating these plagues. And as the plagues got bigger and bigger and more powerful, and they weren't able to reproduce them anymore because the sleight of hand wasn't going to work to bring hail from the heavens, right? What were they going to do? How much sleight of hand could they possibly use to control the weather? So to turn water into blood, there's something you could potentially use to try to create some kind of sleight of hand. Others, however, would disagree and say that no, the sorcerers did have ways and methods of tapping into that dark magic. Certain things they were able to tap into, certain things they weren't able to tap into. Rashi, for example, goes in that approach when he says, why is it that they weren't able to recreate the plague of lice? They were able to recreate a lot of them. They couldn't recreate lice. He says because lice are so small that the forces of tum'ah, the negative dark forces of the world, don't have the power to attack something that's so small. They're limited in their ability to attack something so small. Only God can control something that is of such a small scale. And so that's where they were limited versus what obviously God is not limited. In fact, you could read the whole story of Pesach as a polemic against sorcery and wizardry and witchcraft, in that God ultimately controls everything and everything rests with him. And God can manipulate nature in any way that he sees fit, despite whatever human beings want to do with all of these other incantations and things like that. That's another layer to the story over there for sure. But each one would probably look at the story slightly different. No question about it.
God helped them. God let them do those first few.
Yeah, exactly. God left the possibility open for them to be able to do it.
Because he let.
Exactly.
Kind of like
Exactly. Yes.
all him.
Yes. Bidyuk. Exactly. That's how you would have to look at it. And then at a certain point, God stopped them from being able to do that and limited their powers of controlling those dark forces of nature. So that's a little bit of a wrap-up of that. There's obviously a lot more you can explore and a lot of interesting things that you could do. If you're interested in looking more, chapter 11 of the Rambam's Laws of Idolatry discusses all of these different topics at length. He gives you his approach, and then many other rabbis comment on it elsewhere. You could take a look for a little bit more there. So what I'd like to now do is to venture into chapter 29. Chapter 29 picks up in the story of David. If you remember, we last left off, David was a mole, an inside spy in the Philistine camp. He had run away, escaped from Shaul, took refuge with Achish, the king of Gat, one of the five provinces within the Philistine kingdom, you could call it. And he became loyal to Achish. He conquered many people on his behalf. He brought him back the spoils of war, etc., etc. So David has a nice firm standing of loyalty together with Achish Melech Gat, and that's where we pick up. Now the Philistines are going to war against the Jewish people. And whose side is David on? David's on the Philistine side, which is pretty wild, right? David is now going to go with his new people, quote unquote, to battle his people, the Bnei Israel, right? And so very fascinating what's going to happen here. Let's watch.
What page is that?
We're on page 711. There you go, 711. In the Rabbi Sachs Hebrew English book. Vayikbetzu Pelishtim et kol mahanehem afeka. The Pelishtim gathered all of their military forces in a place called Afek. V'Yisrael chonim ba'ayim asher b'Yisrael. And the Jewish people were camped by the spring of Yisrael. Now, a couple of key points. We probably would read through this, but I think it's important to stop and understand the geography of what we're talking about in the land of Israel. So remember that the Philistines occupy what is today the Gaza Strip, which is the southern, sort of southwest part of the land of Israel, right by the Mediterranean Sea. That's where the Philistine kings are. And they're now making their way into the boundaries of Eretz Yisrael, working their way up northward, right? Now, over here it says that they camped at Afek. Afek is a more southern point, and the Jewish people are in Yisrael. What the Jewish people are trying to do, if you could visualize a map of Israel in your mind, what the Jewish people are trying to do is they're trying to stop the Philistines from encroaching further inland towards Israel to get to the crossroads of the Gilboa Mountains. That's where this war is going to take place, at the Gilboa Mountains. The Jewish people do not want the Philistines to advance beyond that point because that would open up different routes for them and would cut off the Jewish people's trade routes and connections between their northern northern areas and their southern areas. Basically, the Philistines want to drive a wedge in between the land of Israel, separating the Jews from each other in the north towards the south. And the Jews don't want to let that happen because that would block their trade routes, they would block their communications between the rest of their people. And so this is a very key battle that the Jewish people are going to wage in defense against the Philistines, encroaching further and further into their boundary. What is interesting here is our chapter says that the Philistines gathered at a place called Afek, which is very south. If you go back a chapter, just turn one page to 709 and look at, look at verse 4, Pasuk Dalid. There it says, Vayikabtzu Pelishtim, the Pelishtim gathered, Vayavo vayachanu beshunem. They gathered in a place called Shunem. Vayikbot Shaul et kol Yisrael vayachanu bagilboa. And Shaul gathered all the Jewish people to battle in Gilboa. This is much more north from where our chapter puts it. So what's going on over here? Our chapter is saying that the Pelishtim gathered in Afek and the Jews in Yisrael, and then the previous chapter, which supposedly happened first, is actually telling us a more northern setting for the battle. So what exactly is happening over here? Huh?
Push them back.
But it's then you would have to say what? The chapters are what? The chapters are out of order.
Why wouldn't
This
they
is
push them back southward?
huh?
Why couldn't they have been pushing them southward so now they're moved?
But nothing happened yet. No battle took place. Right? Nothing happened in chapter 28. We didn't read about a battle yet. We're not going to read about that battle till chapter 31, right? So what this does is it leads the commentaries to believe that chapter 29 actually happened before chapter 28. The story that we read in our last class in chapter 28 of Shaul asking about what to do with the Philistines is at a later point than when this chapter happened in chapter 29 with David HaMelech. It will soon be evident to us why it is that has to be the case, and we'll have to ask ourselves the question, why did the Navi put these two chapters out of order? What is the purpose of going in this method? Really, chapter 29 should have been placed before chapter 28. So keep that question just in the back of your mind for a moment. We'll double back to it again. But based on the locations of this chapter versus last chapter, it's clear, the commentaries say, that these chapters have to be reversed. That'll become more clear, and we'll answer why it is as we proceed through the chapter. Let's take a look at verse 2. V'sarnei Pelishtim overim lemeot ve'la'alafim. The chieftains of the Pelishtim, remember the Pelishtim as a whole, were divided into 5 major, I guess you call them city-states, provinces, whatever you want to call them, each one with its own chieftain, okay? Some of the places are very well known to us. Gat is the one where Achish is. Then there's Ekron is another one. Ashdod. We know Ashdod. Ashdod is a city that we have today in Israel. It belonged to us. At that time, it was part of the Philistine boundaries. Ashkelon, another city that we're very familiar with. These are some of the cities that were part of the Philistine stronghold. So they have the Sarnei Philistine, the chieftains, were marching along with their soldiers, lemeot ve'la'alafim, in the hundreds and in the thousands, in beautifully arrayed military formations of hundreds and thousands. V'David va'anashav ovrim ba'aharona im Achish. And David and his men on the Philistine side of things were passing through with his men together with Achish. Now, the rest of the Philistine see David. Now, put yourself in a Philistine mindset. When you see David and his men on your side, what goes through your mind? What are you starting to think?
We captured them?
Why is David here, right? Or maybe they think we captured him, but David is not in a prisoner's hold. He's marching along with his soldiers together with the Philistine. What? He traded maybe, but the Philistine are not going to be so happy about David being with them. Remember, their last image of David was what? Killing Goliath. David was the leader who dismantled their most prized fighter and caused them to lose the last battle that they had with the Jewish people. So David is not in their good graces. Therefore, in Pasuk Gimal, Vayomeru Sare Pelishtim, the officers of the Pelishtim said, Ma ha'ivrim ha'ele? What are these Hebrews? What are they doing here? Vayomer Achish el Sare Pelishtim. Achish comes to his defense and says to the officers, Halozeh David Eved Shaul Melech Israel. This is David, the servant of Shaul, the king of Israel. It's not clear if he's calling Shaul the king of Israel or David the king of Israel, because we know that David at that point was anointed. Asher haya iti ze yamim o ze shanim. Guess what? David's been with me for years now. Velo matzati bo me'uma. I've not found anything disloyal with him. Miyom noflo ad hayom hazeh. From the day that he fell into me, right? In other words, the day that he traded teams, so to speak, until this day. So Achish is saying, he's good. He's with me. I've tested his loyalty. He's on our side. The Philistines, they're not happy with this. Vayiksefu alav sareh Philistine. The officers of the Philistines get angry with Achish. Vayomeru lo sareh Philistine. The officers of the Philistines say, Hashev et ha'ish, return the man. V'yashov et mekomo asher hofkadto sham, and send him back to his place where he came from. Velo yered imanu b'milchama. He should not come to war with us. Velo yelanu lesatan b'milchama. That he should not become an adversary for us in the battle. Ubamei yitratzeh ze el adonav. Well, how much, you know what he could do to find himself back into favor with his master, meaning Shaul? Halo berasheh ha'anashim ha'em, by bringing back the heads of our people. In other words, what were they saying? We don't trust this guy. Yeah, he may have been loyal to you in a couple of battles against other enemies, but guess what? We're coming back to fight his people, right? Coming back to fight his members, where he came from. How do you know this isn't an inside job? How do you know he's not a traitor? There's nothing that would put him back in the good graces of Shaul than bringing back 1,000 heads of the Philistines during the battle. We don't trust him. We don't want him coming out to battle with us. Are they right for having this suspicion?
Yes.
Absolutely, right? The irony here is that Achish is trying to defend David, and in reality, the other officers are right for suspecting David. Because at least the approach that we're taking is that David is trying to be an inside agent. He's trying to infiltrate the camp of the Philistines. He's still loyal to the Jewish people. So they're right for calling him out. Verse 5, Halo zed David asher ya'anu lo b'mcholot lemor. Behold, this is David, who they used to say in singing and dancing in Israel, Hika Shaul ba'alafav v'David b'rivivotav. That Shaul killed the thousands and David killed the 10,000s. This was the song that the women chanted upon David's return after killing Goliath, after killing Goliath, and handing the Philistines their worst loss at the hands of the Jewish people. So the Philistines are saying, look, we're not taking any chances here. Send him back. We're not interested in him coming. He's likely to change teams on us. He could trade at us at any time. He could become an adversary. We don't like what he stands for. We're not interested. So despite Achish's attempts to protect David, it's to no avail. Now verse 6, Achish breaks the news to David. Vayikra Achish el David. Achish calls to David. Vayomer elav. He says to him, Chai Hashem, Chai Adonai, as the Lord lives. Ki yashar ata. I know you're really straight. Vetov be'enai, and you're good in my eyes. Setcha boecha iti b'machaneh. If you came and went with me in the camp. Ki lo matzati bechara'a. I haven't found anything evil with you. Miyom bo'acha elai ad hayom hazeh. From the day you came to me to this day. But uv'enei haseranim lo tov ata. But in the eyes of the chieftains, you are not good to them. Ve'ata shuv velech b'shalom. Now I want you to go back in peace. V'lo ta'aseh ra be'einei sarnei Philistine. Do not do evil or wicked in the eyes of the Philistine. Notice that the words ra and tov are peppered throughout this back and forth, this dialogue, this conversation. You can see that he's talking about David being tov versus doing the ra. And so he's going back and forth. Achish says, I know you're tov, but in the eyes of the Philistine, you're ra. So now go back home and do what's good instead of doing what's ra. He's constantly contrasting good and bad. The irony being that in reality, for him, for Achish, is David tov or ra? He's really ra, right? He's telling him, I think you're good in my eyes, but in reality, he's ra, right? It's a very nice irony in that Achish cannot see good from bad, right? He's calling David tov when David is really ra. Who else has been a person who's had a hard time telling the difference between tov and ra? Shaul. Hasn't realized that David is really good for him, and he's thinking David is ra. So look at where David is stuck. When he's with Achish, Achish thinks he's good, but he's really bad. When he's with Shaul, Shaul thinks he's bad, but he's really good. So David can't find a place. Where he's trying to infiltrate, they think he's good, he's really bad. And then in the places where he really belongs, they think he's bad, even though he's really good. David can't find his footing. Just the nature of emet and sheker, good and bad. Sometimes it's hard to discern. Let's go to verse 8. Vayomer David el Achish, ki me asiti. So David tries to push a little bit further. And this could be a bit of a criticism against David. David is not willing to drop the charade very quickly. He insists on remaining a part of the Philistines. Could this be read as maybe David really was willing to fight against the Jewish people? I find that hard to believe. But he tries to keep up the ruse. He says, Me asiti, what have I done? Uma matzata be'avdecha, what have you found bad about your servant? Miyom asher hayiti lefanecha, from the day that I was before you, ad hayom hazeh, to this day. I haven't done anything wrong. Why should you send me home? Ki lo avo v'nilhamti be'oivei adoni hamelech, that I should not come and battle amongst the enemies of my master the king? Now, here's the beautiful words of David. David's words could be double talking, right? His words could be read in different ways, right? Because he's talking about the enemies of my master the king, which Achish thinks he's talking to him. But David could also be talking the opposite way. I'm fighting the enemies of my master the king. My master the king is who? Shaul, and you're my enemies, right? So David is purposely speaking in vague language that could be interpreted lekan ulkan, in this way or in that way. So Achish thinks he's talking about him, but David in his mind could be talking about somebody else. That's the beauty of a double agent, of a spy. Vayan Achish responds, Vayomer el David, and he says to David, Yadati, I know, ki tov ata be'enai ki malach Elohim, that you are good in my eyes, like the angel of God. Ach sareh Pelishtim amru, but what could I do? The officers of the Pelishtim have spoken. Lo ya'aleh imanu b'milchama, and they said, you're not coming to war with us. Ve'ata, now hashkem baboker, wake up early in the morning. Ve'avdei adonecha asher ba'u itach, and the servants of your master who have come with you. Ve'hishkamtem baboker, you shall wake up in the morning. Ve'or lachem, and when there's light upon you, valechu, you will walk, you will leave. Vayashkem David hu va'anashav lalechet baboker. David and his men get up early in the morning to go by the light of the morning. Nashuv el eretz Pelishtim, to return to the land of the Philistines. Ufilishtim alu Yisrael, and the Pelishtim make their way up to Yisrael, and that's where really chapter 28 is now going to happen as they encroach closer and closer towards the stronghold of where Shaul is to bring an impending threat against Shaul. Notice here at the end is what I mentioned in my introduction, that the concept of walking by the light of the day, baboker, is mentioned 3 times at the end of this chapter to paint us the picture that while at the end of last chapter, Shaul was exiting the house of the sorceress at night, going by the stealth of night, disguised, David and his men wake up in the morning, not disguised, by the light of the day, and they walk out. David's sun is rising while Shaul's sun is setting. And remember I said that the chapters are actually inverted. They're actually the opposite. It's to tell you that David's sun is rising just before even Shaul's sun has set. And this is a concept that our rabbis speak about, that Hashem does not remove a leader until he has already put a new leader in a prominent position. So that Hashem is not ready to fully remove Shaul and to kill off Shaul until David has achieved all that he needs to take the place, to fill the role in the shoes of Shaul. Questions? Yeah.
You're saying the reason that it's out of order is because we have to bury that Shaul before.
So it's to kind of make that contrast a little bit. Also, I think what it is that if this chapter happened before, something very important is now in our minds. David did not line up to battle against Shaul. By the time the Philistines actually reach where they're going to engage Shaul in combat, David has already retreated. David has already left the battlefield. We don't want it to be a situation where David is actually lined up against Shaul. This is perhaps why God made this all happen. Despite David infiltrating the camp of the Philistines, God considers it a great chilul Hashem, a great desecration, that David, the next king of the Jewish people, should line up against the people he's about to govern. God does not want that image to be present for anybody. And so, despite David's personal endeavor to try and infiltrate the camp, what he thought was good, God makes his attempts unsuccessful, simply because God does not wish for David to line up in battle against his own people. God does not want that to be the case.
But
Yeah.
why would that be before?
No, it doesn't have to do with before. I'm just saying it's important to understand that idea. Why does chapter 28 come before chapter 29 if it's out of chronological order?
If they had that story of Shaul, what would change?
So that part would not change.
Yeah, but
That part would not change.
Even the Shaul's sun setting wouldn't really change because you're going to
Right, you want
death.
right. You're going to hear about his death in the next couple of chapters. I think it probably has to do. I think they wanted to put chapter 28 there. I guess to contrast with what's going on with David. That would be my best answer. In other words, had chapter 29 come chronologically after chapter 27, which is where it should be, and then we doubled back to chapter 28 about the Ba'alat of. So perhaps the contrast between David's successes and Shaul's misses would not have been as prominent, as highlighted in that situation. That's the best answer that I really could think of. What were you going to say?
No, I don't see the reason, which is usually a reason that we would say that it wasn't out of order, but I guess if it really makes sense that it's out of order because now they're in Israel and that's where they were 2 chapters. Yeah.
Right. So he brings here, he says, it's חשוב שהיה מבחינת הסיפור להקדים את פרשת בעלת עוד ברכנו, על חשיבותו של שינוי זה נעמוד להלן. What does he say over here? I saw it somewhere. He says, כעת נוכל לחזור לשאלת סדר הפרקים שהעלינו לעיל. We can now return to the order of chapters. He says, לו הופיע פרקנו מיד לאחר פרק כ"ז. If chapter 29 was right after 27, לא הייתה בידינו תשובה לשאלה מדוע באמת לא הצליחה מזימתו של דוד. We would not have an answer to the question about why David was not successful in his spying, right? You have to ask yourself the question, why wasn't David successful? Why didn't God allow him to be able to do that, right? He says, Mishum kach ba kodem lachen perek kavchet. For this reason, chapter 28 comes first, Shebo huvrar, where it's clear, ki Shaul holech likrat tevusa b'milchama, that Shaul is going to reach his downfall in this battle. Kehelek min ha'onesh shenigzar alav, as a portion of the punishment that was decreed upon him. V'asher alav noda lo beparashat ba'alat ov, which comes to fruition, which is known to him by the story of the sorceress. Lefichach, for this reason, sibev Hashem et ha'eruim be'ofen shetachnito shel David lo ta'ale biyado. That's why God made David unsuccessful. In other words, if chapter 29 came first, then you'd be asking yourself the question, why wasn't David successful? Why didn't God let him be successful? By having chapter 28 first, in which we know that Shaul is going to come to battle and lose, now we understand why in chapter 29 God did not let him be successful. Why? Because God does not want Shaul to lose to David. If David was successful in what he did, then David would have lined up in battle against Shaul, and Shaul would have lost to David while David was on the side of the Philistines. God cannot have that happen. So by putting chapter 28 there, which tells us that there's impending doom to Shaul in this battle against the Philistines, it now makes sense why God did not let David's plans come to fruition, because he doesn't want David to come to that battle lining up opposite Shaul in a battle that Shaul is going to lose and die. That's the answer that he offers, right? B'milim ha'cherot, he says, in other words, Parashat Ba'alat Ha'ov mechina otanu, the story in chapter 28 of the sorceress, prepares us merosh from the beginning litvusa hatzfuya leIsrael b'yad Pelishtim, for the catastrophe that's about to happen to the Jewish people at the hands of the Pelishtim. Umimela, and for that reason, the kach she'en erech lenisayon shel David l'sayah leIsrael. There's another aspect, because if David was successful, then what would have happened? Maybe no battle would have even taken place in the first place, right? In other words, God is saying, I need the Pelishtim to line up against the Jewish people and win. Shaul needs to die. That's part of his decree. If David is successful, then maybe the Philistines never make it there. Maybe David obliterates them all and they never actually come to battle. So it helps us to answer two things. A, it helps us to answer the question why David wasn't successful. And the answer is twofold. A, if David was successful, we may not have had the battle in the first place, and we need to have the battle because Shaul needs to die in that battle. We know that Shaul needs to die in that battle because that's what the sorceress told him at the hand by God's message. And secondly, we don't want David lining up in that battle against Shaul where Shaul's going to end up dying. So for those two reasons, that's why the chapters seem to come out of order.
But would David, being the character he is, would he have used that deception to line up with the Philistines and make believe I'm on your side, and then turn coat? Would he?
It seems as though he would have. It seems he would have been willing to. Yeah, it does seem as though he would be willing to. Which that in and of itself does not present a really good look for David.
That's what I'm saying.
But it seems as though he was prepared. So God does twofold. He stops David from doing that for David's own benefit, but also because he wants the events to happen in a way where Shaul will lose. And that's what needs to happen. So for all of these reasons, God is orchestrating what's happening behind, and the order of the chapters helps us to put those puzzle pieces in place, even though they're happening in a different chronological order. Good? We can now move to chapter 30. We have about 15 minutes or so to read through chapter 30. Chapter 30 is going to talk about a dramatic victory that David has over Amalek. And herein lies a great circle within the book of Shemuel. Because what were Shaul's two major tasks? And destroy Amalek and destroy who else? The Philistines, right? Shaul was crowned to restore order to the Jewish monarchy by ridding them of their arch nemesis, the Philistines. At that time, the Philistines were more formidable than anybody else. They were the ones who were ruling over the Jewish people. Go back to chapter 4 of the book, way back when they conquered the Aron, and they took the Aron, and they killed Eli, and so on and so forth, and his sons, and so on. Right? So the Philistines have been the thorn in the side of the Jewish people. That was really Shaul's major mission. And then a secondary mission was to destroy Amalek. Both of those missions, Shaul fails. On both of those missions we're reading about in these chapters, who's successful? David. David is the foil to Shaul.
It's very strange that he almost eradicated the entire Amalek. He only left alive the king and the produce, and somehow
We're back.
there's another whole
They're back.
entourage.
Exactly.
So it's-
Well, the Amaleki are a nomadic tribe. It's possible that the others came and joined, or they adopted their charter, or whatever it might be. Yeah.
It's interesting. It's not actually Amalek. Is not actually, we did this in different classes. Like, it's not actually a nation. It's more like
It's a philosophy and a way of life and an idea, and anybody who identifies with that idea is considered part of Amalek. There is a nation, though. There is, but these groups of people are nomadic. They're pirate-type people. They go from place to place. They don't have a land. They don't have a home, and so they consistently end up being resurfacing and being a thorn for the Jewish people. Absolutely. So David is going to bring everything full circle. He's been successful against the Philistines, and he will be successful in our chapter to do against Amalek what Shaul was unable to do. Let's read chapter 30. Vahi bevo David va'anashav tziklag bayom hashelishi. David and his men are returning back home from the Philistines, sending them home from battle, and they reach the place called Tziklag on the third day. Va'amaleki pashtu el negev ve'el Tziklag vayaku et Tziklag vayisrefu ota ba'esh. The Amaleki infiltrated the southern part of Israel towards Tziklag. They destroy Tziklag and they set it ablaze. They set it to fire. Tziklag is one of the cities where David and his men had camped. This is where David and his men's wives and family are. So David and his men at one point rested in Tziklag, left their families there, their wives and children, and went to battle. Now they come back, they find the city is torched, and all of their children and their wives have been taken captive. Vayishbu et hanashim asher ba mikaton va'ad gadol. They imprisoned, speaking about the Amalekim, imprisoned the women and children from young to old. Lo hemitu ish. They did not put one single person to death. Vayinhagu vayelechu ledarkam. And they went on their way. Vayavod David va'anashav el ha'ir. David and his men come to the city. V'hine sirufa ba'esh. And they see the city has been set on fire. Uneshehem uvnehem uvnotehem nishbu. And their wives, their sons, and their daughters have been taken captive. Verse 4, Vayisad David v'ha'am asher ito et kolam vayivku. David and the men that are with him begin to weep and cry. Vayivku ad asher en bahem koach livkot. They cry to the point that they no longer have any more strength even to cry. So they're grieving. Verse 5, Ushte neshed David nishbu. David's two wives were taken captive. Achinoam ha-Yisraelit, Achinoam from Yisraelit, and Avigail Eshet Naval HaKarmeli, and Abigail, who was the former wife of Naval HaKarmeli. Verse 5, Vatetzer le David me'od, David is in great pain and grieving. Ki amiru ha'am lesuklo. The people had said to stone him. The people were ready to stone David for, they believed it was his fault. He was the one who created this whole situation. They ended up leaving the town, and it led them to have their children and their wives and their families taken hostage. Ki mara nefesh kol ha'am ish al banav ve'al benotav, because their souls have been embittered over their sons and daughters. Vayitchazek David badonai Elohav. But David found strength in the Lord his God. David now seeks out God's counsel about what he should do. And again, in here lies a contrast between David and Shaul. Whereas the last time we saw Shaul trying to know what to do, he's got to ask a sorceress. David brings the Urim v'Tumim, the legitimate way of asking a question of God. Verse 7. Vayomed David el Evyatar HaKohen ben Ahimelech. David says to Evyatar HaKohen, remember Evyatar was the one lone Kohen that escaped from Nov Ir HaKohanim, the place that Shaul had butchered. And he says, Hagisha nali et ha'ephod. Bring the apron of the Kohen Gadol to me. Vayagesh Evyatar et ha'ephod el David. Evyatar brings the apron to David. The apron holds the Urim v'Tumim. That's what David's going to ask the question. Vayish'al David badonai lemor. David asks God's counsel and says, Erdof acharei hagedud hazeh ha'asigenu. Should I chase after this legion, this battalion, talking about the Amalekim? Will I catch them? Ha'asigenu. Will I catch them? Will I catch up to them? Vayomed lo redof. God tells him, yes, run after them, chase after them. Stop grieving. You could do something about it. Ki haser tasir, you shall surely catch them. V'hasel tasil, and you shall surely save everybody who's been taken captive. David is given the guarantee by God that if he chases after him, God will help him. Verse 9. Vayelech David hu v'shesh me'ot ish asher ito. David goes together with 600 men that are with him. Vayavo ad nahal ha-besor, and they come to the wadi of Besor. V'hanotarim amadu, and here David and his men split up. They have 600 people. All 600 of them are not going to go. 200 are going to stay behind, and only 400 are going to go. So David's only going to take 2/3 of his army. The other 200 are going to stay behind to potentially protect against an ambush and to watch over their possessions so that they don't get attacked again. They don't get blindsided again. Vayirdof David hu ve'arba me'ot ish. David continues the chase with 400 of his 600 men. Vayamdu matayim ish asher pigeru me'avor et nachal ha-besor. And 200 men who were stayed behind came to a halt, and they remained there. Verse 11, Vayimtzeu ish mitzri basadeh. They find an Egyptian man in the middle of the field. Vayikhu oto el David. And they bring the Egyptian man to David. Vayitenu lo lechem vayochal. They give him bread to eat. Vayashkuhu mayim. And they give him water to drink. Apparently, he may have collapsed of heat exhaustion. He may have lost his way, whatever it might be. Vayitenu lo felah devela. They give him a fig cake, ushnet simukim, and 2 dried raisins, dried grapes. Vayochal, and he eats them. Vatashov ruho elav, and his spirit returns back to him. In other words, the guy is revived, he's strengthened. Ki lo acha lechem velo shata mayim shelosha yamim u'shlosha lelot. For this person had not eaten any food or drank any water for 3 days and 3 nights. Miraculously, he survives. Perhaps to give this bit of news and to show David and his men the way to pursue the Amaleki legion. Verse 13, Vayomedo David lemi'ata. David says to him, where do you come from? To who do you belong? Ve'emize'ata. And where are you? Vayomen nar mitzri anochi. He says, I am a young lad of the Egyptians. Eved leish Amaleki. And I was a slave of one of the Amaleki people. Vayazveni adoni. And my master abandoned me. Ki haliti hayom shlosha. Because I became sick for 3 days. Right? In other words, I fell ill 3 days ago. So basically, in true Amalek fashion, the guy falls sick, dispense of him, throw him down. We don't need him anymore. And it's David and his men who come to save him. Verse 14, Anachnu pashatnu negev hakereti ve'al asher lihuda ve'al negev kalev ve'et siklag sarafnu ba'esh. He says, that we were raiding the south of the Keretites next to Yehudah and the south of Kalev. And as for Tziklag, we set it ablaze and we torched it, right? So they corroborate the story that it was the Amalekim who destroyed the city of David and his men. Vayomer elav David, so David says, Hatorideni el hagedud hazeh, will you bring us to the legion? Can you help us trace where they're going? Vayomer, and he says to them, the Egyptian man, Hishave ali belohim, only if you take an oath by the name of God, im temiteni ve'im taskireni biyad adoni, that you will not put me to death, nor will you transfer me over to my master. You will not return me. Ve'oridecha el hagedud hazeh. If you promise me that, I will take you to this legion. Vayoridehu, so they agree, and he brings them down. V'hinen netushim al penei chol haaretz, ochlim v'shotim v'chogegim b'kol hashalal hagadol, asher lakchu me'eretz Pelishtim u'me'eretz Yehudah. And David comes, and he finds that the camp of the Amalekim are sprawled out. They're feasting, they're drinking, they're reveling in all of the spoils of war that they've taken from the Philistines and from the Jewish people. He sees them in not such a good light. Vayakem David mehanefesh ve'ad ha'erev lemachoratam. David attacked them from the next day at dawn until dusk. Velo nimnat mehem ish. Not a single person ran away, was able to escape. Ki'im arba me'ot ish na'ar asher rachvu ala gemalim vayanusu. With the exception of 400 young men who rode on camels and were able to get away. But the majority were killed by David and his men. Vayatzel David et kol asher lakhu Amalek. David and his men save everything that was taken by Amalek. Ve'et sheten ashav hitzil David. And David saved his 2 wives. Verse 19, V'lo ne'edar lahem min hakaton ve'ad hagadol ve'ad banim u'banot u'mishalal. They didn't lose a single thing. Not a single person died from amongst the men, from amongst the women, or the children, or even the slightest dollar that they took from the spoils of war. They returned everything. They brought everything back exactly as it was. Anything that they had taken from them, Hakol Heshiv David. David is successful in returning everything to them. Of course, he cannot salvage the town. The town was burnt to the ground, but all of their possessions and all of their manpower was all saved. Verse 20, Vayikach David et kol hatzon vehabakar. David takes all of the sheep and cattle. Nahagu lifneha miknehahu. And they were driving ahead of them. Vayomeru zeh shlal David. And they declared, this is David's spoils. Vayavo David el matayim ha'anashim asher pigeru milechet acharei David vayoshivum benachal habesor. David returns to the other 200 people he had left behind, who had come to a halt and did not pursue the Amalekim, and they stayed behind at the wadi of Besor. Vayetzeu likrat David, and the men come out to greet David. Velikrat ha'am asher ito, and to the nation, They come to cheer him on, right? They come to see what happened. Vayigash David et ha'am vayish'al lahem l'shalom. David approaches the people and he asks them for peace. Now something interesting happens. Here comes David with his 400 men who went and pursued and fought the battle. He's coming back to the area where the other 200 people who had stayed behind, and here come all the spoils and everything that's there.
Why is he asking for peace?
Meaning he's greeting them.
Okay.
He's telling them hello, right? He's greeting them. Now. And he has all the people with him. He has all the wives, which of course the wives and the children are going to go back. But now there's a dispute over the money. How are they going to divvy up the return spoils of war? Vayan kol ish ra ubliyal meha-anashim asher halchu im David. They call out all of the evil and scoundrelous people amongst David. And they said, Vayomeru, they said, Yan asher lo halchu imin lo niten lahem. They didn't come with us. We're not sharing what we took back. Why should we give them any portion? They stayed behind. They didn't put themselves in harm's way. We deserve everything because we put our lives at risk to fight the battle. Lo niten lahem me'hashalal asher hitzalnu. We shall not give them a single iota from the stuff that we have saved. Ki im ish et ishto ve'et banav. We're just going to return them their wife and children. V'yinhagu ve'yelechu. And they can go on their way. Now notice the text calls them anashim ra ubliyal. That these are people who are scoundrelous and wicked. For them not to want to share or to benefit others, they simply feel that everything is due to them. It's selfish, right? David here steps to the plate, and herein shows David's great character and his leadership qualities. Vayomed David. Now notice, by the way, David, in Shaul's experiences, Shaul would shrink from aggressive people, right? People who might make a claim like that, we might expect Shaul to take a step back, right? Not attack them, not be aggressive. David doesn't do that. But Yomed David says, Lo ta'asu ken ehai. He says, my brothers shall not do this. Et asher natan Adonai lanu va'ishmor otanu, that which God gave to us and He protected us, that we should be thankful for. Va'yiter et hagedud haba alenu biyadenu. In other words, what is the claim of the people that they should keep everything? We won.
He's saying, but God did it.
He's saying God did it.
God did it.
He says the fact that we were successful is not because of us. It's because of God. So whatever claim you think you have to this spoil, it's not a good claim. So why should we make you more than them? He says, Umi yishma lachem ladavar hazeh. Who will listen to you about this matter? Ki kehelek hayored b'milchama, just as the portion is amongst those who went down to the battle, ukhelek hayoshev ala kelim yachdav yahaloku. It should be the same as those who stayed back and watched. In other words, the people who did intelligence, the people who didn't put themselves in the bullet's ways, but they did something to help the war effort, their portion is just as much as anybody who went down to war, because in the end of the day, it's all happening from the hands of Hashem. So David refuses to buy in to their claim that these people should not get a portion in the spoils. And this becomes such a powerful idea on the part of David that it's adopted into law. From that day forward, this became a statute and a law amongst the Jewish people that all soldiers or participants, whether they went to the battlefield or not, have a portion in the spoils, in what is taken, because it should remind us that it is Hashem who's fighting the battle, not us. The last few Pisukim, we'll read them very quickly, is David taking these spoils and not only dividing it amongst his warriors, but also returning it to the families whom it was taken from. Vayavod David el Tziklag v'shalach me'ashala leziknei Yehuda l're'ehu lemor. David comes back to Tziklag and he sends from the spoils to the elders of Judah to his brethren and says, Hine lachem beracha, here is blessing, mishelal oyeve Adonai, from the spoils of the enemies of God. La'asher beBet El, some to the people in Bet El, ve'la'asher beRamot Negev, and some to the people in the Negev, ve'la'asher beYatir, and some to Yatir, ve'la'asher be'Aroer, ve'la'asher beSifmot, ve'la'asher be'Eshtemoa, ve'la'asher beRachal, ve'la'asher be'arei Hayirach Me'eli, ve'la'asher be'arei HaKeni, ve'la'asher beHorma, ve'la'asher beChorashan, ve'la'asher be'Atach, ve'la'asher beHevron. So all of these are just listing different places that David returned their spoils of war to get them back up on their feet. David is a man of the people. He takes all of those spoils that he had taken, that he had gotten from the Amaleki, which included his own, plus stuff from the Amalekim and the Philistines, and he evenly distributes it amongst all of the people, all of the areas where David has been present, all of the areas of the Ptisa that have supported David. Other people. Other people.
But not his enemy.
What do you mean his enemy?
His enemy, not the people he fought.
No, he fought the Philistines and he fought He fought Amalek and he conquered all their spoils. That included the spoils that were taken from him and his men, but it also included spoils that were taken from a lot of other places and from other things. So David says, we're going to make this an even split amongst all of the areas that are supportive of David. We see David as a man of the people, as a great leader, as somebody who's not money hungry, as somebody who is going to risk himself and his life and the lives of his soldiers for the benefit of the people of Israel. And that is in contrast to some of the things that we've seen, unfortunately, in the missteps of Shaul. So as I noted before, these chapters are flip-flopping back to show you where David is in his development, where he is in his growth and popularity, and where Shaul is, and to see the different trajectories that each of them are on. And that's going to wrap up with the final chapter next week of Shemuel Aleph, with the unfortunate battle and loss at the hands of the Philistines, the death of Shaul and his children in the battlefield, as was predicted in chapter 28 by the sorceress. Be'ezat Hashem, we'll read a little bit about that as we close up the book of Shemuel Aleph, and then see how we progress into the kingdom of David, and that how it begins to flourish and to materialize. Questions or thoughts? We'll hopefully mention a couple of things maybe at the beginning of next chapter, just as we segue into 31. Be'ezat Hashem, we'll begin with that next Monday. Take care.